Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Press Play. I'm your host, JJ48, and tonight we are going to start with a little post-game analysis of the Knights of the Old Republic, uh, both games. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about Knights of the Old Republic 2 ending, which we experienced a couple weeks ago. And I don't know about you, but for me, it felt like it was a little abrupt. Like we beat Kreia, we uh, we ended up talking to her a bit, and she told us a bit about the future of our companions and what they'd do. And then the game just sort of ended. We didn't even get to see Beodur's plan of breaking up Malachor 5. We didn't really get to see that put in action. Um, we didn't get to see any kind of cutscene other than just the ship flying away. I don't know. It's possible that maybe there was uh, a file missing. Maybe it was supposed to play a video or something. I didn't have it or skipped it or something. But it I didn't see anything that looked like it that seemed to indicate that, and so it just seemed like it just happened out of nowhere. It just kind of came crashing to an end there. Um, but we did get to see some interesting parts. We got to see Beodur's plan, where of course we played as the remote. We went around and um, activated some engines to generate the power that would be needed to activate some, was it gravity generators, something to destroy the planet and bring an end to the Sith Academy there. Even if we didn't actually get to see that happen, it was still pretty fun getting to have that plan set in place. The the fact that Beodur never showed up himself on screen makes me think that something happened to him, which also would have been nice if they'd explained it a little bit more. But what happened to him, or was he doing something else, or but that led immediately to a dispute between the droids, where Goto decided he was going to stop the remote because he didn't want the Sith destroyed, because having the Sith as an enemy was vital to his plan for helping the new, not the New Republic, the Republic maintain strength. Like, they needed an enemy to keep from getting stagnant, and so he wanted to stop the remote from activating the plan. And then HK47 shows up uh, to stop Goto. More HK droids show up, which Goto thinks are his and will turn the tables. But of course, because we did HK47 upgraded or uploaded himself into the factory, these droids are now siding with him and stopped Goto. So that was I have to say, a really fun part of the ending, seeing that. Um, and from looking into it, apparently there are some other endings that could, you could end up with Goto actually succeeding in stopping things um, if you played it out a bit different. So that it is interesting that there's still a little bit of agency there, depending on how you played through the game. One of the things I thought was most surprising was Atton's sacrifice. Apart from Beodur just simply not appearing except in hologram form, and uh, at least one of the droids not surviving the dispute, Atton's really the only companion that we actually see die on screen, or that we actually encountered dying, and we were present for it, uh, and were able to comment with him, or talk with him for his final message there. And apparently that was actually my fault, because we could have possibly saved him. One thing I hadn't realized until I looked at this was that the battle with Lord Scion is apparently winnable with Atton. When Atton fights him, it's possible for him to win, and if he does, then he survives and gets to escape with everybody else. I don't know how that would have changed things. Like, is it just Lord Scion gets the upper hand, but because we won, is it just a storyline change, or does it actually change things? Like, yeah, he defeated Lord Scion, so Scion is actually like running off and trying to escape when he encounters the exile. I don't know. Um, and I do. So it was kind of our fault for not actually winning the fight, but I do somewhat blame the game for that. In that we've had scripted defeats before, like when Revan fought Malik the first time, and then Bastila stepped in to hold him off while we escaped, where it was so incredibly easy that we were actually winning, and until Bastila stepped in and stopped us from winning, presumably trying to save Malik. And so when we encountered this, where it seemed like he just ripped us apart almost instantly, and then it went to a cutscene, I just assumed that that's what was supposed to happen. I guess we weren't a very good teacher and just didn't teach Atten how to Jedi very well, so if we had maybe spent a little bit more time buffing him up, he might have stood a chance and could have come with us. So sorry about that, buddy. In general, I think along with the abrupt ending, though, it was kind of surprising how little dialogue there was with our companions on Malachor 5, especially we let the ones who aren't Atten out of prison, and we only really, I think, talk with Mandalore. There's no other dialogue really with any of our other companions. Nobody's protesting, and this becomes even more noticeable when Kreia tells the exile that he needs to go off like Revan to the unknown regions and find the true Sith, and there's going to be some bigger threat and everything. If he's going to be going off without his companions, you'd think there would be a little bit more discussion with them, some protests, maybe even some people just outright saying, "No, that's not going to happen. We're going with you." But I think all of this kind of, well, not all of it. I think a lot of it, though, stems from the game just not having. It did have a bit of a rush development. They bumped up the release date, so it actually had an even shorter time to develop than they had anticipated, and they just had to cut a lot of stuff. So, trying to keep it fair as to what we're looking at, and not judge it too harshly. But it does seem like there's a bit of unfinished, or at least unpolished ending bits. And speaking of cut content, I was looking through. I think I mentioned when we started Knights of the Old Republic 2, a lot of the content was they had to cut content in order to make it to their publishing date. They had to cut out some things that were not completely finished, or maybe this part over here was finished, but the part that ties it in with the rest of the game wasn't finished. So they had to cut it out, and there might have also been some space issues because, of course, back in the early 2000s and when things are on actual discs, then space is a little bit more of an issue than we have nowadays with fully downloadable games. And so there's a lot of stuff was cut. I was interested in just looking at some of the things that we looked at that were some of the restored content. I mentioned I got a patch that takes some of the cut content, and if there's enough of the information in the data files, people have been able to restore it, put it back into the game so that we can experience at least some of it. And sometimes it jumps around a little bit, sometimes it doesn't fit quite so smoothly, but here's some of the highlights I thought that were apparently part of the cut content, or part of the restored content, I should say. So the Handmaiden's mission, the fact that when the Handmaiden joins us, she's talks to Atris, and Atris is like, yeah, go keep an eye on the exile. And there's discussion of how she's doing as a spy who everybody knows is a spy, so is she really a spy? I don't know. Um, Apparently that was cut content. Initially, she just kind of stowed away on our ship, I guess, to get away from Atris or the the rest of the rest of her sisters or something. Um, so that was one of the things that was restored. I gather the entirety of the HK factory when we played as HK47 and tracked down where the HK50 droids were coming from, and had the option of either shutting down the factory or upgrading the HK droids to HK51 droids. Apparently that was all cut at one point and was restored, and I think that includes the interrogation of HK47 interrogating one of the HK50 droids. That was at one point going to be cut out, which I feel like of all the cut content, this, at least of what I saw and noticed, this is the one I think would have been most disappointing to not have in the game, because it was not only a really fun part of the game going through the factory and his HK47 and it had some funny dialogue and a lot of stuff going on, but it also, I think, made HK47 into it really made him from just kind of a little bit of a reference to the previous game to actually a full character in this one. I don't think he would have been nearly so much of character, and certainly not as interesting a character, if all we had was like, oh yeah, hey, there's these new droids that are kind of based on you, and you can't help us fight them because your programming thinks they're you or something. So that was definitely I think that was a big one to enter into it. The attack on Kunda, which was in Dantooine, we had the people, the settlers there, and we had to get things set up to help them take on the raiders. Apparently, initially, like if we hadn't done the restored content, we still would have seen the attack, but it would have just been a little bit on the inside of the raiders coming in and us fighting them off, as opposed to here where we were laying mines, we were assigning squads to different entrances, trying to hopefully hold off the raiders while still keeping people alive. A lot of that was cut and simplified for the initial release, and managed to restore it. A lesser quest, it's not huge on the content, but it was kind of a fun one, was find the Gand when we went into, was it Jektar or whatever, was it Jektar? The aliens only pub where the air's aliens only because the air's hazardous to humans. Where we had encountered the Twi'lek who wanted to find the Gand, the famous Gand, and we had to go around and check all the Gands and see which one was using like a personal pronoun. So that wasn't a major addition, but I did think that was a very fun addition for us, and I do think that would have been. I can kind of see why something like that would have ended up on the cutting room floor if they were trying to focus their efforts elsewhere, but it's good that it got restored. Entering Ludo Kresh's tomb alone. I believe this was I think Ludo Kresh's tomb was the tomb that we went through the cave and entered alone. I don't know. I just saw people mentioning that this was one of the changes, so I don't know if this was initially we would have gone in with our team of companions, or if we just would have gone in and been alone, and not if this is just referring to the cutscene where they're saying, "Hey, some force is holding me back. I can't go with you." Um, Either way, that seems like that would be a really bizarre thing to cut, because if you allowed the companions to go in with you, that would completely change the tomb. That would be a very different experience, I think. Just especially with kind of the personal nature of the visions and the tests and challenges there. And if it was a matter of you go in and they just sort of disappear and you're suddenly in there alone, that would be a little confusing. Um, Although maybe that would be a little less. I guess a Sith tomb, you could just imagine that something happened to them and they were, or that all of you were experiencing different visions or something. At Malachor 5, the party attacking Kreia, if you've, at the very least, we got them all up to being Jedi. I don't know if that matters or if it was just having high influence with them, but when they all attacked Kreia, that was originally going to be cut, which I think would have made it very. I think that was initially cut, and I think also the two areas that we explored in the academy, the 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 areas to the left and right of the main room, were also cut content that had been restored, and I believe it was in one of those where the prison was, where we encountered our companions. So if we didn't see the party attacking Kreia, and we didn't have the prison where we encountered them, then I think that would have left an even more abrupt ending, that we would have just had our companions drop out altogether. Maybe it was meant to. Maybe initially it was meant to be more of a, the exile was the only one who survived the crash or something, except for, the remote able to go activate its plan, and maybe Mira, fighting, forget his name, but the Wookiee bounty hunter. Yeah, it would have been quite a different experience. And along with that, the party attacking Kreia, then Atton running off and facing Scion, that was also initially cut content, which, do have to say, maybe Atton would have fared a little better in this alternate universe without the restored content, in that we wouldn't have let him get defeated by Scion and then he wouldn't have had a death scene. But depending on how that plays out, it could also be, if everybody died in the initial crash, that he would have just been dead either way. So, just maybe best not to be Atton in either case. But all in all, looking at how much of the content they had to cut and was added back in with the restored content patch, there's a lot of story here, and I don't think that it. How would you go away? I don't think that it's necessarily that the game would have been bad without this, especially if you were playing it and didn't know that there was all this cut content. But I can see how after having seen all this content, it would be a very different experience going back and playing the game without it, and I imagine it would feel like a lot was missing. Because, in fact, a lot would be missing. So, looking at the games together, I just wanted to kind of look at their basic storytelling approach. And part of this is because this is very different from a lot of the other games we've played. If we look at the Zelda series of games that we've played that we're still playing on Mondays, we've played through Portal, We played TIE Fighter. Um, all of those games are fairly linear stories. You have a set story arc, you have set story beats that happen, and you have pretty much a set ending. Maybe the ending changes a little bit depending on how fast you got there, or if you got certain things. You might get additional bonuses in the ending, but it's pretty much just a single story. With these games, we've had multiple paths. It's kind of a branching story tree, and the player choice can change the outcome. So, for instance, the first game was probably very noticeable in this, in that in our playthrough as light side, we defeated Malik, helped the Republic destroy the Star Forge, and restored peace to the galaxy, and became heroes of the Republic. We also spared Bastila, so she was able to survive and have her little redemption arc as well. We could have played through Dark Side and either joined with Bastila to take on Malik, or just overthrown Malik and presumably taken over the Star Forge and become a tyrant who now can crush the Republic. And so we can make small changes, such as just choosing in a single dialogue whether we help a guy out or beat him up for money. As we saw several times throughout the games, we had options like that, or we have the major outcomes, such as changing the entire ending and getting completely different outcomes for the galaxy. And what was rather interesting, I thought, was especially in the second game, we could use dialogue to determine past events of the game. One of the most noticeable ones was early on when we first encounter Atten and we're talking about Revan. We can basically choose how we want the first game to have ended. Was Revan male or female? Was Revan light side or dark side? What happened with Revan? We can choose that through the dialogue and kind of make it so, like, yes, in this particular playthrough, this is how the first game ended. And this is always... let me finish this thought first. We also see this... That was probably the biggest or most noticeable one, but we also saw this throughout the game with things of people asking us our experiences in the war, or why we left the Jedi, what happened between us and the Jedi. We could make dialogue choose dialogue options to determine actually how it was back with these events that were supposedly past events, but because they didn't happen on screen, they technically haven't. They don't actually have a formal way that they work until we decided that. And in general, this I did want to talk about, with multiple paths and having sequel games. This is always a little bit of an issue, because you have, in our first game, we can choose an outcome, we can get multiple different outcomes, and now we're making a sequel to that game, and how do we do that? And with this game, they decided to use the dialogue to let you determine the past events. There's still, though, even with this, this works for our particular game. There's still sort of a canon series of events, though. In both Knights of the Old Republic and Knights of the Old Republic 2, I believe they kind of established a canon set of options that this is the way we expect, or not expect, but that the game, or the story, officially went through. So if somebody was writing a book, or somebody, if Disney in one of their shows decided to make reference to these events, there's probably like, hey, here's the official way that things went. Revan was this way, and these are the choices he made. the exile was this way, and these are the choices he made. And that way you have both a way to build on things and a way for, but you're also not hard coding that into the game. You're allowing the player to be able to make that choice for their own personal playthrough. It's kind of an interesting dynamic between the two, I think. So another part of the storytelling is being an RPG, we're able to choose our feats, our attributes, and grow our character and specialize our character. In some of the other games we've played, so for instance, in the Legend of Zelda series, Link grows a bit. We get more heart containers, we get new items, but it's kind of the same growth every time because Link is Link. Yeah, one player might get a heart container that another one misses or something, but in general, Link is always going to grow the same way. He's always going to, get the same abilities at the same time, and because that's part of his story. In this, with the branching paths and everything, playing into that, the RPG elements allowing for the individual players, the individual Revens and Exiles to grow and specialize as they wish, also kind of helps. It kind of helps push this. How do I want to say this? Helps support the idea that the player is really the one in charge of how things turn out, and by having more specialization, you're making it so the even characters that have similar choices in storyline might still feel very different through their different specializations. For instance, a Revan character who's really focused on strength and using lightsaber battling, and possibly even like heavy armor and stuff, is going to feel like a very different Revan than a significantly weaker but maybe more stealthy or more force power focused Revan, even if you're making the same story choices. You can still get quite a bit of diversity in the characters there, and have a different feel for the story, even if the actual story elements are the same. We also have one that I feel is quite different from some of the other games we played, is that here there's a bit more of a disconnect between the player and the character, which is a little bit odd because in a role-playing game, we're playing the character, we kind of have the character standing in for us, but we can, at the same time, we can really play with the idea of the character being separate from us. And one of the ways that the game did this, I thought, was with what the character knows. And so we had some things, such as awareness checks or other skill checks, where we'd be in dialogue with somebody, and one of our dialogue options would be, "Oh, you're aware that what they actually mean is this because you have high awareness." It doesn't matter if I, as a player, picked up on the fact that this person was lying or this person was hiding something. Even if that completely went over my head as a player, my character has high awareness, so they were able to realize that, and I can choose that as a dialogue option. And I chose awareness because that was one of them, but it really worked with a lot of skills. Having a high, was it medical skill? Our character might notice something with somebody's injury that I, as a player, wouldn't recognize. Having having high force sensitivity, our player might be able to force detect something that I as a player wouldn't. So we can play with the character's knowledge by referencing some of the skill checks and saying, well, even though the player might not know this, your character definitely would know this, so let's throw that in as an option. Or at least, maybe not definitely would, but at least it's a possibility that your character would know this. And so that should be an option if you want to make use of it. And this also happened with a lot of personal history. There were a lot of times through dialogue when people referenced things. I think it happened a little bit in Knights of the Old Republic, but of course, with that part of the story was that we didn't really know much of our personal history, so we didn't see it as often. But especially in Knights of the Old Republic 2, as the Exile, we saw a lot of people referencing, hey, why did you go to war? Why did you decide to disobey the council? And our character could have knowledge of things like, well, these planets were being destroyed and we needed to do this, or this is what I thought of the council's philosophy and whatnot. And we could choose those options, and in some cases there were several options that as a player I don't think we ever would have come up with on our own, because it was based on knowledge of our character's past that we didn't have, but our character could bring it up like, oh yeah, I totally know that guy that over there. I think part of this came up somewhat in our interactions with Beodur, that Beodur and our character the Exile clearly had a history that we were the general, he was one of our he was one of our officers, or somebody serving under us that we trusted, and he trusted us. So but I think some of our options were ones that, like, oh yeah, we can either ask about something, or we can say, oh yeah, we totally know about that, and talk about it, even though we as a player don't have that information. So it was just rather interesting in that normally we think of RPGs as being more focused on the player identifying with our character, but by making this little bit of a disconnect and focusing more on what the character knows rather than what the player knows, we can add quite a bit more depth to the story here. We also saw in general that it would build on existing Star Wars lore. That they, of course, it's a Star Wars game. They're using a lot of we're seeing a lot of Star Wars-y stuff: blasters, the Force, Wookiees, all this stuff. Yet at the same time, they removed a lot of direct connections to existing films. By setting it so far in the past, we don't really, when George Lucas made the prequel trilogy, that was set in the past of the original trilogy, but it was still very much tied to the original trilogy, because it was the story of Anakin Skywalker and how he became Darth Vader. Spoilers for anybody who hasn't seen the Star Wars prequels. But by setting this so far in the past, we don't really see any direct connections to existing films. Like we're not seeing things that are referenced in the films. At most, we might have some Easter eggs of, like, oh, hey, I recognize these locations from the films, or I recognize maybe this name. I'm trying to think if there were any in these games. But if we saw like if we saw someone with the last name Calrissian or Antilles or something, we might say, oh yes, that's clearly a reference. This is Lando's ancestor or Wedge's ancestor or somebody like that. But we don't have a direct connection. It's not like, hey, we're explaining how something happened. And so it had kind of this interesting situation of we have this established world, or this established galaxy. We're able to incorporate a lot of elements of it and expand on it, but we have it so far removed from the films that we don't have to worry about exactly how it connects to the films. We can just kind of tell our own story. And presumably, unless there's any major discrepancies of like the very basics of how the Force works or something like that, it's if it's just a matter of like events happening, we're not really concerned about that because by the time of the movies, people have mostly forgotten about these events anyway. And of course, the last bit here is also there was some lore in extra dialogue and descriptions. We saw a lot of the item descriptions we'd read through, and there's little bits of lore there. Talking to people, there's bits of lore. And that in itself was also kind of interesting because some of that there was quite interesting dialogue, or there was quite interesting dialogue, and there were some interesting item descriptions, but all of that pretty much, well, not all of it, but most of it, much of it, was optional. You don't have to read any of the item descriptions. A lot of the dialogue that had these little bits of lore and little bits of story and things, a lot of that was optional dialogue that, we got our mission, we could just say, okay, I'm off and go do it, but we decided to keep on asking, hey, what about this? What about this? What about this? Get that. So it's interesting that that is so much of the story and lore is kind of really optional for whether people if people who are really interested in that, or if you're just more interested in I just kind of want the main story, and I'm just out to fight and continue that. So I did want to take a look at the themes, because one of the things I thought was interesting as I was thinking about it is how both games, even though they tie together and we see some overlap in characters, and 2 is clearly a continuation of the first one and references it a lot, they have some very different themes among the two. For Knights of the Old Republic, I'd say one of the major themes is redemption. We see Revan, of course, his whole story arc is, we find out that we're Revan, and so we've been on the Sith side of things. We've also been helping the Jedi, and hey, we can turn away from who we were and fully embrace this. I have Rakata Prime called out. Rakata Prime was the last planet that we went to with the Rakata, the remnants of the Rakata Empire. This is really kind of hits us in the face because you recall Revan had been to Rakata Prime before and tricked them, and that's how he and Malak got the Star Forge and started their empire. So now when we return again as redeemed Revan, we're meeting people, not just people who vaguely know us as Revan, but who know us specifically as like, hey, you're the guy who came here before saying you wanted to access the Star Forge and that you were going to destroy it, and instead you used it to build a huge empire. Now you're coming here again saying you need to access the Star Forge to destroy it. Why should we trust you? And so we were really faced with the choice of like, do we prove ourselves to be redeemed, or do we prove that we were really Sith scum the whole time? We also saw this with Bastila, who, she sacrificed herself to save us from accidentally beating Malak too early, and Malak turned her to the dark side, and then we have a choice, in fighting her. We can either kill her or we can encourage her to turn back to the light side. Juhani, much the same way. She fell to the dark side. We had a choice to just kill her, execute her, or help her turn back to the light side. Jolee was a little bit of a different kind of redemption arc in that he didn't really fall to the dark side, But he, you recall, he was a Jedi Padawan, and um, I'm trying to remember exactly what his thing was. I think he like fell in love and um, ended up going off to the Mandalorian Wars or something. I forget exactly what Jolie did, but at one point he was. Um, I do remember that he made a mistake, and as a result, he ended up kind of leaving the Jedi without ever being raised to a full Jedi Knight, and kind of turned his back on this dream he'd had of being a Jedi Knight, and I think specifically wanted to be a Jedi counselor and um, you know, be like this wise arbiter and everything. And so he kind of turned his back on that, and us going and picking him up and saying, hey, come along with us and help the galaxy, he kind of gets to come back to that a little bit. It's not really the same type of redemption as falling to the dark side and returning to the light side, but it was still kind of he gave up on his dream and his ideals, and is now we're encouraging him to return back to that. And then we had Malik was kind of a sad example of rejected redemption at the end when we finally actually beat Malik because Bastila wasn't there to save him this time. Um, we actually offered him a chance, like, hey, you can return from all this, and he was just kind of in despair, like, no, I've lost everything, and he died, not actually accepting, not actually really repenting and turning away. So, but even that is kind of fits with the theme, just kind of a example of rejected redemption. And then along with redemption, I kind of put it as its own category because I feel like it is a little bit different theme wise, is a theme of forgiveness. And for because redemption is more, you have some characters who fell and they themselves need to work through their fall, and either they embrace their fall and remain Sith and evil, or their thing, or they are redeemed and come back to the light side. Forgiveness is a little bit different in that the two examples here in particular, Karth and Mission, didn't fall themselves, but they had been wronged and had to deal with that. Karth, um, on the one hand, was betrayed by Saul and wanted to see justice done on Saul, and there was also the issue with Karth's family and thinking that his family was dead, and then finding out that his son was alive but had joined the Sith, and working through that, and Karth kind of having to deal with these issues of like, how do I deal with these people who've wronged me? And I'm not sure if Karth actually really embraced forgiveness, because as I recall, he did kind of settle things with Saul, but it didn't seem like it seemed like we had kind of gotten him off. If I'm remembering correctly, I think we'd kind of gotten him off the vengeance path. So yeah, that's good. If hopefully, if I'm remembering correctly, we managed to get him to at least make it about actual justice and not just vengeance. And Mission wasn't quite as extreme as Karth, but there was sort of a there was the the quest with her brother, and finding out that like her brother had abandoned her, and she's kind of like, well, hey, yeah, it was kind of a for a while she thought it was because this girl he'd fallen in with had convinced him to leave her behind, so she was all upset at the girl. And then we met up with we met her, and she was like, hey, no, I didn't want to leave you behind. Uh, your brother said you were already taken care of, so I just assumed that he was right, and we find out that Griff was really just kind of complete scum. Um, but at the end of the day, mission is still like, yeah, I have to accept that this is what my brother is, but at the same time, I'm not gonna hold a grudge against him, not gonna hate him. I'm just gonna like, you know, seems to have some amount of forgiveness for him, while at the same time telling him like, yeah, I'm not gonna hate you, but I also just don't want you really around, um, if you can't change your ways. And then one I actually forgot to put on here, but it kind of fits in both of these, I think, would be Zalbar, the mission's Wookiee friend, because he was, he was kind of kicked out of his tribe, basically kicked off his planet due to the dispute he had with his brother when he found out his brother was helping Zerka enslave Wookiees for profit. Um, and he had like confronted his brother, but he did so in a way that was considered shameful. And so Zalbar kind of had a bit of a redemption arc, and also had to deal with confronting his brother and his father, and some of the other Wookiees that had turned on him. And so there was some element of forgiveness as well, because while Zalbar did fall, there was also somewhat of a how much of that fall was a moral falling, and how much of it was just like a falling in the eyes of his tribe, who were looking at him wrong. Um, so forgot to put that on here, but Zalbar, I think, kind of exemplifies both those themes rather well. And then one we didn't see as much, but I think plays a little bit more of a role in a more dark side playthrough, uh, would also be revenge. We could kind of see it with some of the elements here as Revan. You could see, um, we had the option of being mad at the Jedi because they basically brainwashed us and wanting to get our position back. Bastila, we did actually see a little bit of this with, um, after she falls and she confronts us, what's she talking about? Like, oh yes, the Jedi were just using me the same way they were just using you, and she wants to get some vengeance at them. Um, so it's certainly in our light side playthrough, it's not as big a theme as some of the other ones, but I think it's still there. So looking at Knights of the Old Republic 2, on the other hand, um, of course, there is going to be a little bit of overlap. We're still looking at light side and dark side of the Force, but where Knights of the Old Republic 1 was very, very focused on the light and dark side of the Force, I think Knights of the Old Republic 2 was kind of looking a lot at the sort of middle area. Not really going fully gray, but kind of questioning both of them a bit more. And so we have here a theme of influence with our companions. We can either be more friendly with them, or we can be more controlling of them, trying to either view them as friends that we want to elevate as our equals, or viewing them as tools that we use until they're used up and we discard them. We have an example with Kreia. Right from the get-go, we establish this connection with her where if one of us gets affected by something, the other one, it can impact the other one. So, we have to figure out like, hey, how do we interact with each other? How are we going to use this? Regardless of what we may think of Kreia initially, we have to work with her due to this connection. We have all of our companions that we got to being Jedi, where by working with them, by getting high influence with them, we we're able to make them from being kind of morally in the middle to being exemplars of good and eventually embracing the Jedi way. Or I think if we went dark side, we could have made them even worse and made push them towards the dark side. Possibly even made them like Sith warriors and stuff. I'm sorry, I should jump back to Kreia real quick. Influence, rather major part, is of course throughout the entirety of the game, Kreia makes no secret of the fact that she is, she's sees some purpose in us and is using us, just in a way that hopefully is mutually beneficial. And she encourages us to view our comrades the same way of like, hey, you don't need to be cruel, you don't need to be you don't need to be mean just for the sake of being mean, but at the same time, like, being kind just for the sake of being kind can also lead to issues, and we always have this balance of the two. And I think most notably, well, we'll actually get there the next one, but Mandalore also, we saw a bit of our influence with him and getting him to is he just a tool that we're using to establish, to get our to help us along our way, or is he a comrade? And to some extent that seems to kind of affect his ending of whether whether he wants to restore the Mandalorians to attack the Republic again, or whether he wants to restore the Mandalorians and be like, hey, maybe we don't need to attack the Republic. We can find other enemies to fight and kind of live at peace with the Republic. That seemed to be kind of where he was going towards the end of our playthrough. And that was because we had gotten high influence with him and were treating him as a comrade rather than just a useful ally. And of course, there's Goto and his whole thing of wanting to use us as a way to keep the Republic stable. And we're trying. Sorry. Goto's trying to use us to keep the Republic stable, and we need to use him to handle some parts of his exchange. But there's always this kind of element of who's really influencing whom, and how much of this is an actual comrades working together, and how much of this is one side playing the other. It seems to be a constant theme throughout, and actually should have added on here with our other companions, Visas, because of course Visas, from the get-go, she's working for Darth Nihilus and tries to assassinate us, but then as soon as we beat her, she's like, oh yeah, hey, I want to join your team. And she's very much aware of the fact that, like, yeah, she was under Nihilus's control, and she actively wants to be under our control, in part, I think, because she just sees, like, she's kind of bought into the idea of everybody's under somebody's control, and so, hey, I'd rather be under your control than his control. And so, and throughout, we can be like, hey, no, you're more of a companion than a tool, so. And kind of playing along with that, but I felt not quite fitting exactly the same way, is the interconnectivity and how every action we take, everything we do, kind of fits together in a larger sense. We noticed this with a couple I didn't mention on here. Well, I start with the Exile going off to the Mandalorian Wars and triggering the end of it at Malachor 5. Um, we lots of things reference Malachor 5. Lots of things happen as a result of that. A lot of the Jedi talked, you know, seemed to make a big deal about our trial in particular. Uh, a lot of the refugees at Nar Shaddaa were refugees of the Mandalorian Wars or the Jedi Civil War that happened as a result of the Mandalorian Wars. Um, and so everything kind of tied in some way to our decisions there. We also had an explicit example given to us by Kreia when we first arrive on Nar Shaddaa, where there's a beggar that we can either give him some money, in which case he runs off but then is beaten up by other people because now he has money and so they beat him up and take his money, or we can refuse to give him money, in which case he runs off and I think starves to death or something because he has no money. And Kreia kind of making an explicit example, regardless of which we choose to do, that hey, your actions have larger consequences, and it's even if it seems like one conversation has gone well or gone poorly, you can't really see how that's going to affect things down the line. So looking at the examples here, we had the Pragus fuel situation. We started off inadvertently destroying the Pragus fuel center, and so that caused a problem on Telos, and then we were able to solve that by going to the huts on Nar Shaddaa and saying, hey, can we broker a deal? And in order to do that, we had to do some other things, and so we were kind of able to fix one problem with another and bring it back to solving Telos's fuel situation. We had the Civil War on Onderon, where everything was kind of building towards this Civil War, and we had to choose our side. And then both of these, the fuel, I believe the fuel, and certainly the Civil War, come back around when we get to fighting the Sith at the very end, where we saw units from Onderon and some Mandalorians and other people we've helped along the way come to Telos to help us against the Sith, because we had helped out with their civil war, and Telos Station is still standing because it has fuel, and we helped out with that situation. So some things that we encountered very early on in the game kind of come full circle by the end of it. HK47 thought was also an interesting example in that we had HK47 is of course the reason that the HK50 droids exist, is they were kind of based on him, but he's also we have this connection between them that they view each other as parts of themselves, so he can't attack them, they can't attack him, and ultimately culminating in when he went to the facility and ended up shutting down their production and kind of breaking that connection. But at the same time, then he, at least in our playthrough, established a connection with the HK51 droids of kind of uploading his own, at least elements of his own personality into it, so they kind of follow his philosophy of assassination as opposed to the HK50 droids' philosophy on assassination, and kind of has this interesting new connection, although we don't really get to see that explored too much because the HK51 droids come in so late and it was cut content. We didn't really get to see a full resolution of that, I think. But it is, I think it still fits with the theme somewhat. And so then I just wanted to look at kind of generally how this fits in with Star Wars, and its relationship with Star Wars. Probably could have put this up with the storytelling approach, but just kind of a reminder, this happens like 3,000 years prior to the events of the Skywalker saga films, and So we're very far removed from them. Pushes the lore back even farther than that because we have the Rakata Empire that was referenced in Knights of the Old Republic collapsed over 20,000 years prior to the events of the game. So, and that's not even when they were established. They had existed for like 10,000 years prior to that. So we end up with this very extremely ancient um, series of events here. Uh, One of the biggest things I thought this really brought to the Star Wars series was tells us more about the philosophies of the Jedi and the Sith, and it's not that's exclusive to these games. It's possible some of the other books and other games and things have gone into that, but of course you also have to keep in mind that um, even with lots of books and lots of games and lots of story elements, not everybody who's playing this game is going to be familiar with everything Star Wars. Some people playing this will have read all the books and have played all the games up to this point, and um, be fully versed on their Jedi and Sith lore. Some people will have just seen the movies and um, will they'll have seen the movies and that'll be it. They won't know about all the books and all the games and all the other side content, and so you want to be able to make it. Uh, you want to make sure you're exploring enough so that they can understand things and not have to have other knowledge. And you might even have some people playing a game that's playing this game who haven't even seen the movies. It's hard to imagine, but there I think do exist some people who've not seen the Star Wars movies, and they might still play the game and get their entire view of what Jedi and Sith are might be through that rather than through the rather than through all the other content. So uh, regardless, the point I'm trying to make is I think even though there are other sources where we might not be getting information that is only available here, you might be able to get this in some of the other sources. It's still good that it's expanding on these philosophies here, so that people who aren't reading these other sources can still see more about the Sith philosophy, more about the Jedi philosophy, more about their uh, strengths, more about their weaknesses, more about what do these philosophies actually mean? What does it mean to have like the light side of the Force and the dark side of the Force? And in addition to that, or kind of expand on that, that's one instance of it expanding on the lore. It's expanding on a lot of other lore as well. For instance, we have different races. The Mandalorians we encountered, learn a lot more about them. I'm not sure if the word Mandalorian is ever actually spoken in the original Star Wars trilogy. I know a lot of people were familiar with it. In case you're not a huge Star Wars geek, assuming you've at least seen the movies, Boba Fett, the bounty hunter who captures Han Solo in the original trilogy, is uh, wears Mandalorian armor. I forget if it's ever said that he is a Mandalorian or if it's just said that he wears Mandalorian armor. And I don't know if it ever actually says that in the film, but a lot of the content that came out after, I'm sure the Kenner action figures probably referenced it at some point. You had card games, you had all sorts of things that would reference little nuggets like that. And so people were at least familiar with the word Mandalorian long before we ever saw more of them. But it was interesting to be able to take that from just, hey, here's Mandalorian is associated with this kind of cool looking armor, to like, hey, here's a whole big story about the Mandalorians and who they are and what they do and what does it mean to be a Mandalorian? What's their motivation and what are they like? Similarly with the Sand People, we see the Sand People in the original Star Wars, in A New Hope, um, where they're just kind of these native raiders on Tatooine, and we were able to turn that into like a whole thing of like, oh, they have a whole culture to themselves. They have a whole, um, yeah, they're not very friendly with outsiders, but once we earn their trust, they're willing to share quite a bit with us, and um, that was kind of fun, and seeing a whole different side of them. And I hadn't planned this, but I just realized both of these Mandalorians and Sand People were also expanded upon in some of Disney's recent um, series, Star Wars series, in The Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett, which kind of fit together pretty well. They expanded on both the Mandalorians and the Sand People in those. So, and of course, we also see places that were just briefly mentioned, like Dantooine. We get to see a lot more of in the games. I don't think we never even see Dantooine in. Certainly not in the original trilogy. I don't think it's seen in the prequels either, and I'm fairly certain it's not seen in the sequels. Although I guess I'm less certain about that than I am of the prequels in the original trilogy. We just hear it mentioned, but now we get to actually see it a bit more. We get to see, yes, it's 20 or 3,000 years prior to the events of the movies, but we do get to see what it was like back then, and we can kind of imagine, okay, some stuff might build up, but it's probably going to be more or less what it is now, just advancing a bit more. And places like Kashyyyk, which I think I'm also not sure if Kashyyyk is ever actually mentioned in the original trilogy. It's of course where Wookiees come from. If you ever saw the Star Wars Holiday Special, you've seen uh, you've at least seen some version of Kashyyyk, although you would certainly be forgiven if you've repressed that memory and have no recollection of it. And we do see Kashyyyk a little bit in the prequels. One of I believe Yoda goes to Kashyyyk to try to convince the Wookiees to help the Republic in their fight against the Separatists, and there's a battle between the Wookiees and the battle droids on Kashyyyk. But we don't really see much of it, so to see a lot more of it and learning more about Wookiee culture and seeing especially I have to say I've always thought tree houses were kind of neat, so having an entire planet where the trees are tall enough that you're basically building everything in the trees, and you only really go down to the forest floor if you're an adventurer looking for a fight against the really big beasts and stuff. It's kind of a cool idea. So with that, I think we've kind of gotten a decent look at the Knights of the Old Republic stuff. Yeah. So this brings us to the end of Knights of the Old Republic, because unfortunately there is not a Knights of the Old Republic 3. However, I think we will be returning to this story eventually, because there is an MMO RPG, a massive multiplayer online RPG, called Star Wars The Old Republic, which has elements that tie into this and refer back to this. And at some point I'd like to go into it and play through it, but it's going to take a little bit of planning to figure out exactly how I want to do that. And two, I think as much as I like the Star Wars games, I'd like to play some other games as well. So we'll take a little bit of a break from that. Also, I had been hoping to show a dark side playthrough of Knights of the Old Republic and Knights of the Old Republic 2, so we can look at some of the differences. But unfortunately, I have not had time the past few weeks to complete that and get that together. So I think what we'll do instead is, for now, we'll move on to our next game, which, if you if in case you didn't hear what it was, you've actually been listening to the title screen music for it. It's going to be Hogwarts Legacy. And then, depending on how long that takes, if that goes on long enough that we feel we need to take a break, we can always do an intermission to look at the Knights of the Old Republic, Dark Side playthrough videos. Or if it doesn't take too terribly long, I expect it to be a decently long game, but I'm not expecting it to take hundreds and hundreds of episodes or anything. Yes, if it's not too terribly long, we might just push that to the end. But we will look at that eventually, but not just yet. And hopefully we'll be able to still remember enough about Knights of the Republic when we get there to be able to notice some of the differences. And then, like I said, we'll play Hogwarts Legacy. We'll move on to we'll play some other non-Star Wars games, and then eventually, when we feel like we want some Star Wars again, we might come back to Star Wars: The Old Republic, and find out more about this era of Star Wars. All right. And so with that, I'm going to stop the stream momentarily. I will be back in just a couple minutes. Just want to get things shifted over to Hogwarts Legacy setup and be able to have a nice stopping point for the video. So I will be stopping the stream, but if you just hang around a little bit, I'll be back on in just a couple minutes. So see you in a few.